The release of the Tamron 35-150mm f2 to 2.8 earlier this year has seemingly given the Sony world one ginormous boner. And rightly so, because first impressions suggest that this could be the all-in-one workhorse lens that we've all been dreaming of. But is this lens actually better than Tamron's classic combo, the 28-75mm f2.8 and the 70-180mm f2.8? Well, today we're going to find out.
I'm not a princess. You can call me Highness. Thanks for having me. I'm rough around the edges, but I'm as precious as a pearl. If you hand over the kingdom, I'll be the ruler.
So when it comes to quite literally weighing up these options, rather surprisingly, there isn't a huge amount of difference between the two options. Of course, these weights are for the lenses by themselves, and so they don't include the additional weight of a camera body as well. And if you were going to be lugging around the traditional two lens combo, then you'd likely need to factor in buying and carrying around two camera bodies. That way you can maximize the flexibility of having both lenses readily available at all times. Now, the only slight problem is that once you do this, it becomes immediately clear that the 35-150mm has the edge when it comes to weight. In terms of features, the new lens has 3 customizable AF lock buttons, an MF to AF switch, and a zoom lock switch to help prevent the lens barrel racking out whilst it's hanging by your side. If customizing the functionality of your lens is something that really tickles your pickle, then hold on to your crotch. When you connect this lens to your PC using Tamron's included software, you'll be able to completely customize the functionality of the 3 custom buttons and more. What's more, you can store up to 3 completely different button configurations and use this handy switch on the side to quickly change between them. So moving on to the classic duo, starting with the 28-75mm G2, this lens only really includes a custom function button. So there's no zoom lock and no MF to AF switch. This means that toggling to manual focus mode has to be done via the back of your camera. As for the 70-180mm, this has even less features to talk about, with no buttons or switches at all, other than a zoom lock switch on the side. Though the good news is that even without the lock button, we still didn't notice any kind of lens creep, besides the person behind the camera. One final thing I should mention is that all of these lenses are built mainly from high quality plastics rather than metal in order to help keep the weight down. Though despite this, they all feel very nicely put together and solid in the hand. Also, all of the lenses include weather sealing, though none of them come with built-in optical image stabilization. In terms of price, the 35-150mm is the slightly cheaper option, priced at £1,599 or $1,899. Whilst on Amazon you can purchase the 28-75mm and the 70-180mm for a combined cost of £1,888 or $2,098. So when it comes to dishing out points for price, the 35-150 definitely gets the early lead. In terms of build quality, I'm going to have to give points all round here because all of the lenses are very nicely put together. However, for handling, the 35-150 is the clear winner for me because the all-in-one solution is just far more practical, and it also includes a better array of buttons and switches. When it comes to autofocus, in good lighting conditions, all of these lenses were rapid to focus with no signs of hunting. In low light conditions, all of the lenses slowed ever so slightly and took a little bit longer to lock onto their target, but they were all still totally usable and none of them hunted wildly out of control. When shooting a moving target at 70mm at f2.8 in continuous burst mode, the vast majority of the photos were sharp and in focus, with only a handful being just marginally out of focus, mainly as George got super close to the camera. So with a near flawless performance all round, both options gain yet another point. When shooting a moving target in video mode, all of the lenses managed to keep locked onto George as he walked towards the camera at a regular pace. When repeating the test at a faster pace, again all 3 lenses still managed to keep locked onto George without any issues at all. As for AF noise, all of the lenses were incredibly quiet. When it comes to manual focus performance, the 35-150 and the 28-75 G2 both have a bunch of customizational options once you hook them up to a PC via the USB port, which means that you can fine-tune the handling to your own personal preference. The 70-180mm, however, is a little bit older and therefore it doesn't include this newer tech. This means you're stuck with the handling performance as it comes out of the box, and unfortunately it does suffer from a super long throw and a slightly delayed reaction, which means that focus pulls can be a little bit awkward to perform. Luckily though, none of these lenses suffer from any major amounts of focus breathing, which is more good news for videographers. So at the end of this round of testing, with yet another positive experience, it's points all round once again. In our Bokeh Balls test, the results were surprisingly very similar with all three lenses. All of the images showed nice round orbs at the centre and actually across the majority of the frame. It's only really when you get right into the corners of the frame where the balls start to appear as if they've been chopped in half for some bizarre reason. The only other small distinction that I did notice between these results is that the balls did appear quite textured, and the 28-70 and the 70-180 in particular did show some signs of an onion ring effect. As for general bokeh quality, the results were once again very similar, though if I was being super picky, I would have to say that the 28-70mm displays marginally softer bokeh with less texture, but it really was very, very close. So again, with features just too close to pick an overall winner, it's points all around. Now, all of these lenses do an okay job at protecting from ghosting and artifacting, though at a push, I would have to say that the 35-150mm displays slightly more prominent artifacts. So that said, if flaring is something you really prefer to avoid, then the good news is that all of these lenses come with lens hoods included in the box. On a longitudinal chromatic aberration test, both the 35-150 and the 70-180 display lime green fringing at the top, whilst the 28-75mm exhibits more of an aqua blue fringe. Below the area of sharp focus, the 35-150 offers the best results with very little coloured fringing, whilst the 70-180 is in a close second place with just a touch of red colouring, with the 28-75mm in last place with a more prominent amber fringe. Given the almost flawless performance displayed by all of these lenses so far, it's probably no big surprise to hear that when I went out into the real world to take some images, I came back with some absolutely stunning results. Regular viewers will know that I'm more of a prime lens man myself, so shooting with these big heavy zooms for the day did take a bit of getting used to. The two lens setup was particularly heavy, especially with the two camera bodies by my side. However, one benefit of having the two zooms over the all-in-one option is that you can split them in half, so if you're not going to use anything longer than 70mm, you can quite happily put the longer lens in your bag and forget about it for the minute, and then use the much lighter 28-75. When you're doing that, the combination is actually much lighter than the all-in-one 35-150. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that there are definitely pros and cons to both options, and it's not quite as clear as I first thought as to which would be the preferred choice. Now, speaking of focal lengths, one thing we haven't really talked about is the difference between the two focal lengths offered by these two different options. Now, obviously going down the route of owning the two zoom combo will provide you with the longest overall focal range, spanning all the way from a wide angle 28mm to a telephoto end of 180mm. And this is fairly significant because obviously the new lens is only going to give you a total focal range of 35 to 150mm. And when you compare the results side by side, the difference between the two ranges becomes immediately apparent. Now, obviously this shorter zoom range is the trade-off you have to make if you want to have an all-in-one lens, especially one that has a maximum aperture of f2 at the 35mm wide end. And on that note, I should add that the f2 aperture is only available between 35mm and 40mm on the zoom. After that point, the apertures start to progressively close down until you get to around about 80mm, where it gets to f2.8 and sticks there for the rest of the zoom. So if you're like me and you prefer to shoot your portraits at the longer end of the zoom, then this f2 aperture might not get used all that often. And even if you do happen to prefer shooting at the wide end of the zoom, then you will have to settle for a 35mm wide end over a much wider 28mm offered by the two zoom combo. But the question I'm sure you're all asking is, which is the best in terms of overall image quality? Well, when shooting wide open at the wide ends of these zooms, it really is tough to pick an overall winner just from looking at these real life images. However, when we take a quick look at these lens charts, it does appear that the 35-150 has slightly more contrast and is very marginally sharper at the center. However, at the corners, the 28mm end of the 28-75 is considerably sharper, with the 35-150 providing a very soft and smudgy result. At the middle of the zoom range, at 70mm, the 28-75mm is the clear winner, followed closely by the 35-150 and the 70-180 providing the softest and most washed out results. At the corners, the results are very similar, though arguably the 35-150 is now a touch softer than the others. At the long ends, the 70-180 really comes into its own and provides a much sharper result than the 35-150. And it's the same kind of story at the corners too. If shooting close up is your thing, then the good news is that all three options offer a very short minimum focusing distance. Though it has to be said that the 70-180 takes this to a whole nother level, and this thing can focus super close up. In terms of image quality at this distance, all three lenses are pretty much on par. So when dishing out points, it appears that the old faithful combo combo of the 28-75 and the 75-180 is the better choice for overall image quality, because between these two lenses you will achieve the sharpest results at the wide end, the mid-range and the long end, and that means it gets the final point. But that said, I think the 35-150 still deserves half a point in this round because the results it produced really weren't all that far behind the two zooms. This means after tallying up the scores, the 35-150mm lens is the overall winner, mainly due to it being a powerful all-in-one combination with bags of features to boot. So does this mean that it's time to ditch the dual zooms in favour of this new lens? Well, it all depends really, because if the idea of carrying around a bag full of glass and multiple cameras all day makes you die a little bit inside, then this new all-in-one option is almost certainly the lens you've been dreaming of. However, if having the ultimate image quality is way more of a priority to you, and maybe you actually quite like the flexibility of having multiple lenses to choose from, then this classic zoom combo will more than likely continue to be your weapon of choice for years to come.